And good evening, I'm Benjamin Morgan, the Chief Executive of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association of Australia, and I welcome our members and industry supporters to our Facebook live broadcast for Tuesday, the 11th of August. This evening we were going to be speaking with a helicopter pilot that had a run-in with a four-wheel drive, but we've held that broadcast over until next week. So we are joined this week with a very special guest, Glen Buckley. Glen was the former owner and director of the APTA, the Australian Pilot Training Alliance, an innovative business that was set up down in Victoria to provide an AOC flight training approval on a membership basis to small flight training organisations and aero clubs to help them navigate their way through the Part 141, 142 changes, which were implemented by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. Changes that resulted in making access to flight training almost too difficult for small organisations and too costly. This innovative approach by Glen and his team created an organisation in which small companies could participate and they could remain competitive up against the larger multinationals, which were starting to enter the Australian marketplace at the time. APTA as a business, however, did not last long in the market. Very shortly after gaining an approval from CASA, which took almost 2 years and several hundreds of thousands of dollars, the business was unceremoniously shut down. Glen joins us tonight to talk about the issues behind this and obviously give our industry and our members and supporters an opportunity to learn more about the relationship between Glen, APTA and CASA. So good evening, Glen.
Good evening. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Ben. Cheers.
That's okay, mate. And we're also joined by none other than Ken Cannane, the Executive Director of the Aircraft Maintenance Repair Overhaul Business Association. Ken, as usual, it is always a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure, Ben.
So, Glen, I just gave a very brief overview, and before we kick into it, I just want to lay out a couple of ground rules.
Yes.
For our conversation, and also just to make you aware of a couple of other facts. The ground rules are that this series of Facebook Live panel discussions are designed to be a candid and open conversation about facts, an opportunity to talk about your particular situation from your perspective and for you to put forward your side of the story. However, in the lead up to this program, I was contacted by several industry associations who had passed on to me that this evening's program was being watched carefully by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and their legal team, and that we would need to be very careful because they were looking to pounce. Obviously, you and I have had some conversation in terms of your involvement with CASA as an organisation, and so I would ask that we try to keep our conversation this evening to the issues as you have already published via public sources, and to refrain from using any personal names in that process.
Well, understood.
Okay. With that aside, let's kick off into the beginning of this story, which is the start of APTA and how the concept came to being and those initial steps. So maybe if you could give our listeners an overview of how this concept came about and why you felt there was a need for this particular membership model to be implemented here in Australia.
Yeah, certainly. Okay. No. All right. Thanks very much, Ben. And just, if you don't mind, I'll just take the floor and just do a little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind, to start off before I tend to the question. Just first off, Ben and Ken, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity here, and particularly to AOPA, Ben. As you know, we're a very fragmented industry, aviation in Australia, especially the flight training industry, charter industry, etc. Everybody's fighting to keep their business alive. And AOPA is probably, well, it is the only organisation really that gives us a voice in this opportunity. So I'm very, very appreciative of it. I'd also like to point out that you've been very, very clear to me that I'm not to name people. Okay. And I just want to say everything I say tonight and my experience is actually to try and support the industry. So everything I say will be truthful. Everything I say, I'm happy to stand 100% behind in any court of law. In fact, I would relish the opportunity for CASA to give me a legal forum to express my views and justify my actions and decisions. And I will be trying to avoid mentioning people's names. If I do inadvertently let a name slip, and I can certainly won't be intentional, I'd just like to point out that I cast no aspersions against anybody outside of their work environment. These people that I've been dealing with in CASA, they may get down to the Bunnings or the local footy club and flip sausages and be very supportive of the local community and good members of the local community. I can make no comment against that. What I can comment is, again, my own personal experience with some very vindictive and some very vexatious people within CASA who I'll do my very best not to name. And just one other little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind, before I start, I just want to thank, it's a fantastic industry, Ben. Like, really, I've been chased out of it by CASA now after 25 years. But the people that I had the opportunity to engage in over the past 25 years, it gives me enormous strength. It's the people that have supported me on P-Prune, Auntie Prue, AOPA, the people that I've worked with, the many wonderful staff, the students, the overwhelming support I've got from other business owners who've had their livelihoods destroyed by CASA. It's been very, very uplifting. And I can tell you I've been in a very, very dark place with this, Ben, because I've lost everything as a result of these actions, absolutely everything. And I'll talk more about that later. But the thing that really, and I mean this sincerely, has got me through is actually the support of absolutely everybody that's helped me through the industry. It's been, I'll probably get emotional later on when I think about it. Just a quick story I'd like to recap with. You know, I was left destitute by this, absolutely destitute. And this is only one example of the good people around me. My car broke down. I didn't even have a car. A group of people led by, you know, somebody that I know through the industry, got a group of my old students and staff together. They did a whip around and they rebuilt my car for me and got my car up and going. I mean, these are just the wonderful, wonderful people who are in this industry. And it's just how many people have lost their jobs as a result of my action. Not just my business. They've closed down several businesses as a result of this. Many people have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment. And it's heartbreaking. But I'm just really uplifted by the quality and the caliber of the people that work in this industry. And I'm so sad to be out of it and not have those engagement with those people. And in actual fact, I'm so embarrassed by what I've been through and so traumatized by it that I'm actually embarrassed to even catch up with these people anymore because it's such a complicated story. So I just want to thank you, once again. Thanks very much. You do a great job, Ben. I know you're quite vocal, but that's what we need. That's what the industry needs because it's an industry that gets hammered by CASA. We get intimidated and people can't speak up. So it needs independent, strong voices to represent us. So if you're not an AOPA member out there, join up, please.
Okay, well, there's the sales pitch. That wasn't necessarily the direct question I asked. But let's start, Glenn, with in the beginning. You obviously are no stranger to flight training. You've been involved in flight training for nearly 25 years or over 25 years. And you had purchased, or at least you'd set up a flight training organisation out of Melbourne called Melbourne Flight Training. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and at some point in the journey along the way, and you've obviously been involved long enough to see the introduction and the changeover and introduction from the previous system to the CASA Part 141, 142 debacle.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously had an idea. You could see what was going to happen with the introduction of these new regulations, and it created this innovative approach which gave birth to APTA. Could we start with really what was going through your mind in the lead up to that?
Absolutely. All right. So I opened a flying school with a very dear friend of mine. I call him, well, his name is Pete. So I opened up the flying school with well, I'm getting some messages up here. Wow, I'm already getting emotional, Ben, by some of the messages popping up. Like I set up a flying school with a very, very dear friend of mine, Pete, in 2006. And we set that flying school up with a very, very best of intention. Way before there was any requirement to have a safety department, we had a very well-funded safety department. We paid all the pilots award back in the days when pilots didn't get paid award. That was the most important thing. In fact, that was Pete's criteria for joining in the business that we did that. So it was a very, very ethical business. And I grew that business to become one of the busiest flying schools in Melbourne over those 15 years. And I didn't spend a single cent on advertising. That business grew on word of mouth alone by treating everybody with respect. And like a lot of small business owners, it gave an enormous amount of pride. And a lot of hard work, but an enormous amount of pride. Then CASA, now you've got to remember the CASA regulatory program of Part 141 and 142 was introduced a decade behind schedule. It was postponed and postponed again and again and again. And finally, a decade behind schedule, at a cost to the Australian taxpayer of hundreds of billions of dollars. This new regulatory program called Part 141 and 142 is coming up. Now, my business, in Australia, we have two different commercial pilot licenses. There's a 150-hour commercial pilot license and a 200-hour commercial pilot license. Most flying schools in Australia have the opportunity to deliver both the 150-hour commercial, which is GST exempt, and the 200-hour commercial pilot license. Obviously, a very strong preference for the 150-hour commercial pilot license that was GST exempt by the vast majority of students that approached it. Unfortunately, with the introduction of this new legislation called Part 141 and 142, it actually took away the opportunity to deliver the 150-hour commercial pilot license unless you became a Part 142 flying school, being the higher category. So finally, when this legislation was introduced, I was staring down the barrel of losing 90% of my revenue if I didn't transform the organisation into a Part 142 organisation. I had too much pride in it, and so I elected to go down the path of pursuing the Part 142. I approached CASA with a concept because the legislation massively increased the costs. The costs that would be imposed on my business far exceeded by a multiple of about 5 times the profit that business made. And I'll be very open and transparent because my staff were always entitled to look at the profit and loss statements for my business, which I drew my income out of.
Well, Glenn, it's a very interesting, I'll stop you there. It is a very interesting point that you make, in that you're saying, and what you're alleging there is that the introduction of 141, 142 dramatically increased the costs for you to perform flight training and to provide a service to the customer. Is that correct?
Oh, Ben, to put it in perspective, I had a business that in a good year made about 100, and all of these things I'll back up. I'm open to any sort of, everything's very clear. I'll produce the profit and loss, but that business made about $100,000 profit on a good year. The cost of operating my business overnight went from, my salary structure increased approximately $500,000 per annum. The reason for that was I used to run the business. I was the CEO, the CFI, the chief pilot. The new requirements of Part 1, if I was to step up to 142, required 2 CASA-approved CEOs, 2 CASA-approved head of operations, previous chief flying instructor, and 2 CASA-approved safety managers. Now, I'm all for increasing safety, and I'm all for increasing oversight and accountability, but these are just costs that my business had absolutely no way to continue. So faced with a massive increase in costs, or a loss of 90% of my revenue stream from the 150-hour CPL, I went down the path of the Part 142. It became immediately apparent that the size of my school, I couldn't afford to continue. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the IGA supermarket, which is a brand of small businesses that come together under a umbrella called IGA that compete with Coles and Coles. Getting distracting messages, Danny. Good on you, Mel. So set it up on an IGA model. The idea was, and APTA had only go into the new environment. My criteria were, I wanted to increase safety, increase regulatory compliance, and protect the Australian-owned sector of the flight training industry. They were the 3 objectives of me setting up APTA. The idea was that we would get a group of schools to come together, operating under one approval. There was only the one, what we call aircraft operator certificate, and that was the one that I owned. Those schools would come underneath that umbrella and have access to a well-funded safety department. And to put that in perspective, that safety department had a budget of approximately $250,000 per annum. And that was facilitated by bringing 10 flying schools together and contributing $25,000 each. We had exceptional personnel there. It was very, very well resourced. And the accountability rested with me and my key personnel. It was one operation with those schools. And that's how I planned to address the new regulatory environment that we were going into. Now, CASA is unable to produce, and I challenge them because these are facts. No safety case for it. In fact, CASA themselves said that they couldn't produce, adequately assess what the safety benefits of the program were. So it leads you to question why we would even do this anyway. So we went down this path. I established that.
I'm just going to jump in from time to time because I just want to push on certain issues, because I know that we have a number of senators and MPs that are watching this broadcast with keen interest. And I think it's critical, Glenn, that we really hammer in on some of these points so that we get this message across. And that really is that this is a business model that was set up in response to CASA changing the regulations to 141, 142. And that as an entrepreneur and as a guy clearly interested in aviation, you went out and you were engaged with small aero clubs and small flight training organisations who were all deeply worried that under the new system they could not comply and they could not afford the regulatory system that CASA was forcing on top of them. And so you've created a model that would bring these organisations together and provide a professional safety management oversight surveillance system to allow them to train pilots in a safe, professional environment. This is what you were trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And in fact, Ballarat Aero Club had ceased operations prior to joining us because they couldn't attract key personnel, the cost of operating the business. So that's exactly what it was about. It was about coming together and actually presenting a force that could actually compete against the foreign flying schools. And I'll point out, Ben, this was something I built. I invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in this. I worked side by side with CASA personnel for 2 years. They gave me 600 points that they wanted addressed. They wanted to address each point, assess each point, and sign off it as part of our procedures. So I sat with them for 2 years, playing ping pong with them, addressing every single requirement that they wanted. And I've got it under freedom of information. They assessed every one of those points, and they gave me the approval to continue on. So there's no doubt that CASA was heavily involved in it, and they were very supportive of it. In fact, CASA personnel, who I have a lot of respect for, recommended some small organisations to join us to ensure their continued survival. My problems, everything changed for me. Everything changed for me. We have an oversighting team called a certificate management team, a very failed system that CASA is now pulling apart because of the spectacular failure of it. But CASA operated on what were called certificate management teams, and they comprised experts from certain areas of safety, flying schools operation, maintenance, etc. And they would oversight the flying schools. I'd operated with an exceptional CMT, very well respected in the industry, and not just by me, but by all the operators. I speak to the operators. And I am actually going to, well, I'm not going to name the person that led that team because I don't want him coming. He's a CASA employee and I don't want him coming under CASA spotlight. But I had an exceptional team of what I refer to as CMT2. I was notified by CASA that I was, after a decade of being with CMT2, I was notified that I was having to change to CMT3. Immediately on receiving that notification, I have it in my pile of documents here, I wrote to CASA because there was someone on CMT3 that I knew was going to bring harm to me and my business. And I knew that because of comments that that individual had made about me publicly to other people and got back to me. I immediately wrote to the region manager. I requested a one-on-one on the record, not an off-the-record meeting. I wanted it documented by CASA. I requested a one-on-one on the record meeting, and I raised my concerns to the CASA region manager about a member of my new certificate management team. Those concerns were ignored. The change of team went ahead, and immediately, there was a complete change of approach from CASA, and they began to dismantle the business, which I'll go on more about later. There's no doubt in my...
Again, I'll just apologise. To keep the flow of this going, I'm going to come back and stress some points, and I'm going to let you go a little bit further. And I can see Ken off to the side there, almost rolling your eyes and shaking your head, Ken. I mean, we deal with this, across engineering, across flight training, and private aircraft ownership and pilot medicals, and just another example of how this industry is just being abused. But Glen, you went through, and I can only imagine you're saying 600 items.
More than 600.
That you were required to respond to in the process of what you've said to me was a 2-year approval process to get the APTA initiative approved by CASA. I mean, I find it hard to believe that CASA would not have known what this business model was about. I find it difficult to believe that they in some way did not know what they were approving or how you intended to run this business. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's no doubt they were fully involved, Ben. Fully involved. I mean, I've got the checklist where they assessed it, but I was working with well-intentioned people at that stage during the process. They shared the vision. They could see the upcoming problems. They supported the concept. So, yeah, they were completely involved in. And in actual fact, when CASA came to all of the flight training organisations, and this is evidence of CASA leading me up the garden path. So when this new legislation came in, they said the final deadline of it was introduced. CASA approached all of the flying schools and said, what date are you going to complete your transition by, which was changing over to the new regulatory environment? And CASA have this in writing. My advice to CASA was, I will be ready on time, but I will be the last school in Australia to transition because it doesn't increase safety and it massively increased my costs. So I'll be the last school to transition. Now, what happened was the original date ended up having to get postponed by 12 months because probably only 10% of schools had met the deadline. CASA approached me and they said to me, Glenn, we need someone to take a leadership role on this. The uptake is too slow on this. And I said, look, I want to go last. And they said, yeah, dive in with you, yeah.
So, Glenn, so CASA had said to you that the uptake of their 141, 142 was slow, that clearly there was no interest in this.
Well, absolutely, because after the CASA identified what they called the transition date, they made it very clear that flying schools were not permitted to operate after that date. So CASA was staring down the barrel of 90% of the flying schools in Australia not meeting that deadline and being shut down. They asked me to take a lead on it. I did somewhat reluctantly, and many other operators warned me, don't take a lead, because they knew of the CASA experience. They came to you and said, don't be the first, Glenn, don't be the first. But I did take the lead. And then I had the complete reversal of opinion. It was ludicrous.
So CASA approved the AOC. You go through this exhaustive 2-year period. You've committed hundreds of thousands of dollars. APTA was given the green light, and from what you were saying to me, you had 9 operators join your membership. What was their experience, and or your experience in helping manage those operations? Was it working positively?
Oh, it was brilliant, and in fact, many of those operators wrote to CASA and met with CASA and actually gave the feedback. Ballarat Air Club delivered their first ever instrument rating. They went and purchased a simulator. The flying school became busy again. The committee was wrapped. These members, they got a new energy about them, a new capability, and we were able to share resources and expertise. One flying school that didn't have aerobatics expertise could draw on the experience of another flying school that had aerobatics experience. A school that had flight instructor expertise could help develop the flight instructor courses in other member schools. The access to the safety department, it was very, very positive. The feedback was very positive, and I had new members wanting to join.
So a successful model, it's moving forward at this point in time. How did it go wrong now? What was the event? And I tend to find, I've said this before, Ken, you've probably heard me say this, in almost all of these stories, you get to a point in the timeline where someone has managed to offend someone or get someone offside, and now the whole mood changes and everything's taking a turn for the south. Was this another example of that? Was there a moment in time where you realised suddenly the relationship is souring?
Well, what it was then, it was quite incredible, really. It was the change of that CMT team, and as I say, it just happened. I opened up an email. The business was progressing. Now, we'd been CASA approved, and I'd had a CASA audit, a level 1 audit, which is the highest audit that CASA can do. I got through it with beautifully. We got commended on it. It was exceptional. Now, in this whole process, CASA's never, ever put up a safety argument. There's never been a claim of safety. And this is one of the things, when CASA acts inappropriately with other operators, they usually have a safety card to draw on as they work on burying them. In my case, there is no safety case. And I challenge CASA. I've asked CASA again, and they won't put it in writing. I've written to them and asked them again and again, and they deflect from it because there was never any safety case. There was never any regulatory breaches. I will come back to fabricated audit results that were produced many months after an audit later on in the conversation, which I challenged CASA on, they weren't able to justify. But no, Ben, there was never a safety case. Okay. I believe what it was I was a critic of CASA. I was a critic of CASA wasting hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' funding right from the start of the Part 142 project. I was opposed to it very strongly because I knew that it would allow foreign ownership, let foreign ownership penetrate the Australian flight training industry, which it did. I knew that it would decimate regional flying clubs, as it did. I knew that it would cost jobs, as it did. And I think what happened over the passage of time, my public comments were vindicated. So I think
So
that
Glenn, the first time I got to meet you was you travelled all the way to Tamworth in 2016 to attend the General Aviation Industry Rally that I had put together prior to me joining AOPA.
Yes.
And I remember you standing up at that event, speaking directly to Barnaby Joyce and the then Transport Minister Darren Chester on the issue of dealing with CASA and the fact that CASA are not accountable for their actions and they appear to be getting away with things that quite possibly they probably shouldn't be. You obviously went to the trouble of writing to the Deputy Prime Minister and also the Minister for Transport. Were you given any response or opportunity to meet with the government to talk about this and to provide any level of testimony as to what you've experienced?
No, completely stonewalled all the way along. And at the end of that conference, Ben, I walked across the tarmac next to the CASA chairman at the time, okay, not the chairman of the board any longer. I walked across that tarmac with him. And I said to him, Part 142 will destroy my business like many other businesses. And he looked me in the eye and said, no, it won't, Glenn, no, it won't, trust me. Now, he's long gone, admittedly, but the passage of time has vindicated. He was completely wrong. It's destroyed many businesses.
So I want to go back to this. I've asked the question. You wrote to the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Barnaby Joyce.
Yes.
Did you get a response from Barnaby Joyce and were you given an opportunity to meet to go through these issues?
Okay. Ben, I've written letters wanting to meet with everybody. I've asked to meet with the board, Mr Carmody, Mr McCormick, everybody. And I will say he might be a controversial character, but Barnaby Joyce, another person from the aviation industry, facilitated a meeting with me and Barnaby Joyce. So I did get the opportunity to get up to Parliament and I did get to put the story forward very early in the piece. Before CASA went on for many, many months after this, but early in the piece, I did get the opportunity to meet Barnaby Joyce. And I know he's a controversial character. I don't know what yours or Ken's feelings are on Barnaby Joyce, but my experience with Barnaby Joyce compared to Michael McCormick, chalk and cheese. Barnaby Joyce was very good. He was very honest, very forthright, very transparent. In actual fact, his word to me, Glenn, you're the model litigant. They were his words to me.
So I understand that he was nice and he's possibly afforded you an opportunity to speak. But from that meeting, were you given any opportunity to make a formal testimony to government, to provide evidence to government, for the government to formally take that evidence so that an inquiry or an investigation could take place into the actions of the regulator?
No. And just
what about the Transport Minister at the time, Glenn, Darren Chester? Did you write to Darren Chester at the time?
Many times, Ben, completely ignored, whitewashed. They just keep deflecting. And what I find is that these people in government, they deflect back to CASA. Talk to CASA about it. But you're dealing with the people, you can't go back to CASA. Now, when I talk about CASA, not everybody. CASA's 900 employees. Probably 895 of them are well-intentioned. But a fish rots from the head first, Ben. It needs good leadership, whether it be the military, big businesses, anything requires AOPA. It requires good, strong leadership with vision. So we're going to politicians and they deflect back to the very people who are putting you through this torment to resolve with it. It's impossible. So no, I never got a meeting with anybody. But I won't stop until I do. And I think Senator Susan McDonald, I believe, has an interest in this issue. And from what I hear, is very well intentioned, very capable, very intelligent, very articulate. So my hope is that you'll distribute this to her if she doesn't see it. And I would love the opportunity to meet with her.
The thing that is a common theme in many of these issues that we've been discussing, and I'll just take a break with you, Glenn, and I'll just fire over to Ken, is largely that in just about all these instances, Ken, that you and I have been across from both AOPA and AMROBA, we have member businesses and participants who write to the various ministers. They write to their local MP, but the politicians are simply not engaging and they're not taking action to provide any level of accountability for the Australian people who rely on these regulators and authorities.
Ben, I think one of the big issues is that we seem to have lost the concept of what regulatory reform is about. Back in the late 80s, when that was started up, to redraft the regulations was to keep Australian aviation legal and to actually put things in place that allow the Australian aviation to use innovation and expand. But over time, as different people have come into CASA and they've changed the philosophy to it, even back when we introduced CASA Part 21, we had a big failure there because 50% of the little small manufacturing groups, their approvals actually didn't because they couldn't come up to the standard and everything else that was required. Hindsight to that, it was really manufacturing in the course of maintenance, and there was a bit of a muddle up, so we lost a lot of certificate holders. Then we introduced licensing and things around. The system we put in place never is based on keeping the employment there. It is not based on making sure jobs stay, and it's not there to enhance the business and allow business to grow. It's been put together with a brain set of looking at pure regulations and very little risk management from within CASA. It's always the case, I've always said it, you ask a legal person about it, they're risk averse, and it's natural to their nature. Aviators, people who work in, we've been managing risk for many, many years, and the regulations should be more styled to match the type of Australian and the culture of Australian aviators. That's where the regulatory system seems to have lost its direction. It's about creating more red tape and more, even green tape's coming into it, but they also are building silos throughout the industry, which is preventing a broader level and many more people gaining employment in this industry.
Glen, obviously we've arrived at a time CASA decide from what you're saying that they no longer want to support the APTA model, and they start dragging you through the ringer, so to speak. Being in that situation, and I guess you're desperately trying to deal with CASA to resolve the issues, and I've seen this treadmill before where they start to throw everything at you and you're just flat out, you're a small business owner, you're just an ordinary Australian, you don't have endless buckets of cash. You're not on the government payroll spending the taxpayers' money to fight endless litigation and to pursue your man at whatever cost. You're an ordinary Australian that has to earn the money that you then have to waste in responding to these legal issues to fight for your rights to own and operate a business in this industry. I mean, where do you turn? Where have you been told you can turn with all of this?
Well, look, I've been to the, initially I went to the Industry Complaints Commissioner. The problem with the Industry Complaints Commissioner, I don't want to cast aspersions on the person in the role because I think the person in the role is well-intentioned, but the system is fundamentally flawed because the Industry Complaints Commissioner is part of CASA. They draw their salary from CASA. So automatically the process is going to be somewhat flawed. Now, then if you pop that with people in CASA who are quite happy to mislead and protect their positions, you can't arrive at a fair outcome. Now, I have also been to the Commonwealth Ombudsman. It's a very big investigation. Stage one of that investigation has been completed. And I have posted it on pre-prune as an attachment, but the Commonwealth Ombudsman's found that CASA's decision was actually unlawful. Their initial action, and if I could spend a moment on this, so CASA initially based their action, this change of CASA philosophy, they used a document called the Aviation Ruling. Now, the Aviation Ruling prohibited the sharing of AOCs. Mine wasn't a sharing of AOCs. Mine was one AOC with accountable people. But the AOC, the aviation ruling was written for the charter industry, not for flying training. It came out of an Essendon operator who was shut down by CASA. The next day, that charter operator popped up again under somebody else's AOC. So CASA came up with what they called the aviation ruling in 2006. It has no head of power. It's not a legal document. It's just CASA's opinion. And CASA went to the flying schools in 2006, and I was one of those flying schools. And CASA specifically briefed us that the aviation ruling applied to the charter industry, not to flight training. Yet 13 years later, CASA pulls out the aviation ruling that has no head of power. We were told doesn't apply to us, and they tried to make it to apply to the flight training industry. It's outrageous.
Mate, it's incredibly sad that it's gone on to this extent. What really bothers me with this is, as you're highlighting, industry participants are being asked to take their concerns to people like the Industry Complaints Commissioner. And as you say, what kind of complaints commissioner and what effectiveness is this person going to have when they're on the CASA payroll and they report to CASA management or the CASA board? Which brings me to a really interesting question. I mean, have you tried to take these issues to the board of CASA, who are actually responsible to ensure that the organisation is being run properly and that they are not abusing their powers?
I am convinced. Now, when I point this out, the board, there's been a lot of changes in board membership. There's some new members of the board. I believe there's 2 new members of the board that joined the board in July of this year. However, so I can't cast aspersions on them. And my hope is that they will see this, and I intend to send it to them. And my hope is that those new board members will act with integrity, will act with good intention, will act with ethics, and will act to ensure the good governance of CASA. However, the existing board members, and I will name it because it's public knowledge, Mr. Anthony Matthews, I'm casting no aspersions on him, he is the chairman of the CASA board. That's public information. But I wrote to the CASA board with very, very strong allegations of misfeasance, malfeasance, of not following CASA's own regulatory philosophy, breaches of the PGP Act, unlawful conduct, all of what I wrote multiple occasions. They were completely ignored by the board for 6 months. Not even an acknowledgement of my allegations, which were very substantial. And they can be found on PPRU and Anti-Pru if someone wants to look at them up. And I will post these again on those forums for people to have a look at. But I made very serious, substantive allegations. And I actually sought guidance from the board on what should happen. Completely ignored. They're complicit in it.
Frustrating experience. So we've got a minister that's refusing to listen, refusing to take action. We've got a CASA board that's refusing to provide you an opportunity and for them to take action. And we have an executive management at CASA. What have they done? Have you written to Mr Carmody directly, and have you raised these concerns with Mr Carmody or Graham Crawford?
Frequent occasions I wrote to Mr Carmody, then Mr Carmody wrote back to me and said he refused to discuss it further with me. I have that in writing, just refused. Point blank refused.
Any basis as to why he would refuse that conversation?
Just to cover up. These are my, I have to separate AOPA from these accusations. These are Glen Buckley's accusations. I want them tested, but I'm sure in the maintenance side, and certainly from the pilot's perspective, all the qualities, the things that would make the most dangerous pilot is somebody who doesn't act with good intention, somebody who doesn't admit their mistakes, people that try to facilitate. These are all very, very dangerous traits in the aviation industry. Very
so Glen,
dangerous.
I'll just go back. You're alleging that there could potentially be a cover-up there. It's a very strong allegation to make. Do you believe that there has been, that the actions of CASA are indicating that to you?
Ben, their conduct, and as we go through this, I'm going to outline some of the unlawful contact that's been put on me. This is a reverse engineered project, Ben. They have thrown everything they can to crush me, everything. And I'll talk about some of these things as this conversation goes on. I'm talking about falsified audit results. I'm talking about wrong documents. I'm talking about collusion. I'm talking about misleading the Commonwealth Ombudsman in his investigation. These are very, very serious allegations.
Glen, if you were given the opportunity, if Senator McDonald tomorrow were to contact you call you before the Australian Parliament via the Senate RRAT and give you the opportunity, give you the protections that are afforded to witnesses who provide testimony, would you testify before the government and provide all the documentation to, I guess, back up these allegations?
I would, but I don't need the protection, Ben, because CASA's already crushed me. I've lost my home, my business, my livelihood, my life savings. I'm destitute. I have nothing left. So there's nothing to be protected from. The damage has already been done. What I want to do, I would love the opportunity, because I want to stop these people in CASA doing it to anybody else. I've been contacted by many people who have had their lives destroyed by these same individuals. This must change, Ben. It must change.
Ken, do we have, I know I would answer the question, but in your opinion, is there a cultural problem inside of CASA in the way in which it's dealing with industry? Do we have a problem here that requires direct and meaningful intervention?
I think you got two factors built into this. Within certain areas, I've got to pay a lot of respect to some of the people that are in CASA. Some of them in the regional area, from areas that we've dealt with, they're trying their hardest to do things. But I think internally there is a conceptual problem of where they want to go with that regulatory reform. It doesn't seem to be regulatory reform that'll grow the aviation industry in Australia. It seems to be regulatory reform that looks after certain sectors of the industry, but it's not allowing the whole industry to grow like it should do, like it was doing before this reform started. We need to somehow or other build the culture that within the standard area, the developing area, the people that lack the experience and knowledge of the industry itself, who are physically just making changes to things based off documents and reading something from foreign plans or something. It's not doing this industry any good, and the industry continues to decline. And flying training is the crucial part of the whole system. We need to get right back to and have all the different varieties of type of flight training, and have an idea like Glen's come up with. That should have been picked up by CASA. It should have been encouraged, because it would have brought back a lot of aero club type flying trainings, which we got tossed out of the system back in 1988. We need to rebirth that to get the general aviation growing, and industry could prime the government with thousands and thousands of jobs. So the concept and culture of the people that are developing standards and that need to get more in line with the Australian industry, and not based on a book learning of some other foreign system.
Ken, we've obviously had Senate inquiries. There's been no end of reviews, a judicial inquiry, a royal commission. What's needed? What will be needed? What can be done to clean this filth out of the National Safety Regulator to ensure that participants of this industry are not being victimised and their rights are not being abused?
I think we need executives in CASA that have got a performance-based mentality, and their success is built on the growth of the industry. And if you work on a system of writing regulations, well, you can have very safe aviation industry, but you don't have many people in it. And that's what they've done since 1990 in relation to general aviation. Back before 1990, we'd had 1,800 basically single pilot training schools based right throughout this country, and everyone in the country would go out to the airport. There was always some flying instructor there. That is totally missing, and that's why we're not getting a number of pilots into the system. We've got to go back and say, you got to not make the mistakes of the past. You got to look at it. The American system's got a very good model to work from. We need this capability to be able to work, and having a 142 providing the oversight for smaller ones. It's a brilliant idea, and something CASA should have looked at, and they should have even considered even making regulatory changes, because safety is not the factor. This was a ministry processes only that's destroying the industry.
And I think that mirrors, Ken, what Glen is saying here, and that is that if what Glen is saying is true, and I don't have any reason to doubt Glen at this point in time, that is that there's been no safety concerns brought forward by CASA in his case. There were no regulatory breaches brought forward in his case. So if there was no safety or regulatory concerns, exactly what was the concern of CASA in allowing these small aero clubs and small flight training schools from collectively working together to create a safe outcome that allowed them to navigate the 141, 142 framework so that they too could participate in aviation? I mean, this is starting to basically smell like CASA was actively seeking to force the individual businesses into their own approvals, because potentially this model might have shown up that people were not able to work with the regulations that CASA had created. Effectively, one argument could potentially be that this was actually a very sad indictment of CASA's failure to deliver a workable flight training framework that small to medium-sized businesses could use. Glen?
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's their own fears. Unfortunately, this is the quality of bad leadership, Ben. And as Ken alluded, there's a lot of good people in CASA, but poor leadership comes from people's fears and insecurities, and that's manifest at the executive management level within CASA. It's their own insecurities and their own fears. If something like this succeeding actually highlights their deficiencies, that was one of their motivations, I believe. But to drive them to the level to actually participate in unlawful conduct is very, very concerning. And I look forward to the opportunity to address that later on. And no doubt there'll be people from CASA watching this. And I absolutely encourage CASA to take me to court. Let me stand in front of the court and let me expose you for the unlawful, immoral, unethical conduct. Save me the money. I'd love CASA to drag me into court. I implore them, and I've written to that effect to them before. Please, if what I'm saying is not true, take me to court.
The problem is, though, Glen, is that this is not a way to solve this particular problem, and these issues should never be getting to this level and to this position. There should have been intervention well before it ever got to this stage, and it is a wholesale failure. Make no mistake. It is a wholesale failure of the CASA board to do its job properly, to ensure that the participants of this industry are protected against abuses of power at the hands of the CASA executive and interior management team. And so this really does need to be investigated. Every aspect of this needs to be looked at in detail. And we need to somehow get the government to actually stand up and play a role here in fixing this, because the message, Ken, I'd be interested whether you agree with me on this. The message I'm hearing from one side of this industry to the other is that we have abuses of power going on where they shouldn't be going on. We have regulatory overreach. We have enforcement overreach. We have an organisation in CASA that appears overly enthused to take everything to a legal position and to cost the industry and its participants the maximum possible amount. And you could look at, if you sat on the sidelines and you looked at Glen's case, you could argue that such actions are potentially there and are designed to render the person incapable of fighting back. Glen?
Oh, without a doubt. But I think what we're going to see, Ben and Ken, I think what we're going to find, and I don't want to get too political because I don't have any, I'm a swinging voter, but I think increasingly we've seen the National Party become really irrelevant in Australian politics, and not even more so under Michael McCormack, but it's just a party now that doesn't pull a lot of weight. It doesn't really care about the regional flight training industry. But I think what we'll find out of this whole coronavirus thing, I think that we find that a decade of mismanagement by CASA has decimated our industry. We're universal in that. It's been destroyed by CASA. Now, to be topped off with the coronavirus pandemic going through the country now, that will be the nail in the coffin for this industry. The time to act is now, and I believe that I believe Scott Morrison's well-intentioned. I think the Liberal Party, and that will be my tact going forward, it's a waste of time dealing with the National Party. I intend to take this to the Liberal Party. I will push Scott Morrison to step forward and actually work diligently, or direct the National Party to work diligently to create jobs, because this industry is in a lot of trouble. This is really make or break for the industry. This will be the nail in the coffin for the Australian-owned sector of the industry unless Scott Morrison forces the National Party, Michael McCormack, the CASA board to act. And all the structures are in place then. CASA has a regulatory philosophy. We have the Forsyth Review. The CASA's regulatory philosophy, which they publish on their website, it's there. Hold them to account to it. The board could do it. If CASA had followed their own 10 points on their regulatory philosophy, and if anyone hasn't seen it, just Google CASA regulatory philosophy. About 10 points on it. They're easy to follow. It's about good intent. If CASA followed that regulatory philosophy, the industry wouldn't be in the trouble that it's in now. If CASA followed the Ministry Statement of Expectation, we wouldn't be in the trouble that we're in now. So it needs strong political leadership to hold CASA to account for the obligations that they're bound by. The Civil Aviation Act, which one of CASA's functions is clear and concise aviation safety standards. It's in the Civil Aviation Act. It's the function of CASA. I put a forum up on P-Prune about how CASA achieved that. I think 1,000 responded. 95% of people on that straw poll, if you like, 95% said CASA had failed to achieve clear and concise aviation safety standards. And if 95% of people didn't know the road rules, it's not safe, it's dangerous. Something's gone very seriously wrong. It needs strong political leadership. And I call on Scott Morrison, or I call on somebody in the National Party to show good leadership and save this industry. My story's destroyed. I'm out of the industry now. I'll never be back in it. Don't let it happen to anybody else. Please, Scott Morrison, somebody, step forward. Senator Susan McDonald, please save this industry. Save the good people, the well-intentioned people. Make CASA do what they are supposed to do.
Passionate, still in the face of enormous adversity there, Glenn. You have to admire it. Ken, it smacks of the whole more right than we've ever got wrong. Obviously Glenn's making some very strong statements about the National Party not standing up and not representing regional Australia and protecting their constituents against a regulator that's out of control. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I tend to. We've spoken a number of times to different members of Parliament about this problem within it. We know there's Senate inquiry going on, which seems to be sympathetic towards it. But I've been around long enough, and I've seen Senate inquiry after Senate inquiry. I've seen review after review after review. And if you really sit down and look at those reviews and say, has any of that really been put into place correctly? And you've got to sit there and say to yourself, no, it hasn't. And the simple reason that I'll just go back to the first Civil Aviation Safety Reg made was Part 21. The Americans amended that quite dramatically. CASA has stood up in front of a bilateral meeting with the FAA attending and said they will now adopt and harmonise with the American Part 21 where it came from originally. And what the Part 21 did in the United States was clearly identify the industry responsibility and devolve work to industry. And then they said, that we know what our job is now in the FAA, you know what your job is, and you've got to approve all the design data to make sure that you take responsibility for what you actually do. So what it did was make that industry over there work more efficiently. We have adopted that part. You've got to keep them there picking up. If you decide to follow that line and stay with it, you should be picking up every amendment they do to it, and you should be putting it into the Australian regulation. That concept is so showing the regulation, and the same mistakes that are with the regulation are still sitting there today. And the same applies to just about everything else as it does within a system. If they adopt a foreign rule, when they pick it up, they'll take parts out of it, or they'll change those parts, and then it doesn't work as efficiently as it does in another country. And every time they do this, I know there was mistakes made with the civil aviation regs way back in 1988. Some of those mistakes are still there today. I know I tried to get rid of a couple of them are in there. They're still in there. And it's just, CASA, when they sort of put something out, it goes right back to the mentality with the CAA. If you make a rule, you never admit it's wrong. You don't fix it. You just make it and you apply it to the industry, irrespective of the cost of the industry.
I'm often, when I reflect on these issues, I think, you try to say to yourself, can it possibly be that this organisation is that incompetent? Can it possibly be that CASA is so incompetent that it could get so much wrong on such a scale that just about everything that they touch is a disaster? And it's incomprehensible to think at that first level that when you look at the scale of the problems that CASA has with industry, whether it's with the airlines, the maintenance industry, the flight training industry, the private aircraft ownership, the recreational side. I mean, these guys have got problems from one side of this system to the other. Is it sheer incompetence or is this intentional?
Oh, I find to me, I can't do the concept of how this is intentional. It's got to be something to do with the competence. It's got to do with the actual government. The government actually put in place the Civil Aviation Act. The Civil Aviation Act is very, it's dated, it's out of, and it was never put in place correctly to implement CASA as the proper regulator it should be. If you go and look at the infrastructure website, it states in there that CASA is responsible for a certain number of annexes. Go and look at the Civil Aviation Act and say, where does it say here that CASA is responsible for those particular annexes? It doesn't say that. And it doesn't even say CASA in the Act as a state of a registry. It doesn't say in the Act that it's a state of design. It mentions that it can manage design and all the functions, but it doesn't put down the ICAO sort of standard responsibilities of what they should have. And until you get that act fixed, the concepts and the attitudes that will work in there, because if you're not, and it's no longer the case in Australia, we don't have experienced regulators that have come through the system that's gone into the head office and provides the guidance of how it actually practically works out in the industry. Without those skills set within it, it needs to be a completely revised approach to the way it is. And the first thing to fix up is the Civil Aviation Act, so it gives the right direction and the right attitude towards it. And we got stands here, and I've had many administrators and many member of Parliament, many senators all take to us telling us the red tape will be reduced. I've seen no reduction in red tape since we started the Civil Aviation Authority back in 1988, and it's ever increasing. And recently, it's just over the top. Industry's finding it extremely hard to even come to terms with. Like 600 points to set anything up, that's got to be way past the norm.
Sorry, Ben, you're not coming through there. I don't know if you've run.
Sorry about that. I was just saying incredibly frustrating, but incompetence or by design. I mean, in my experience in business and in life, the people you need to surround yourself with sometimes are your greatest critics, because they're the ones that are able to give you the unfiltered truth as to exactly what is going on, to give you the best possible opportunity to rectify and fix it. From my perspective, I see CASA operating in a bubble. They don't want to hear from anyone that's critical. And you've already outlined this evening that you feel that by being critical of CASA's processes and policies, and I imagine that's been from a position of wanting to see the industry improve, that has made you a bit of a target. Do you feel that there is sheer incompetence, or do you think this is ignorance, or do you think that this is all by design?
Look, I personally think my view on this is, as I say, it comes back to leadership. I think that there's a lot. I truly do believe there's a lot of very good people in CASA, and I noticed a couple of comments across the bottom there calling for a royal commission, and I absolutely concur. I'd love to see a royal commission, but that's a big challenge to get the government to actually admit to that there's a need for a royal commission. I think it just needs change of leadership, and it needs more competent people in there, and people will act with integrity and truth. And it just needs captains to walk into the flying school at the start of the audit. And they'd start before an audit, they say, we're here to check that you do what you say you're going to do. And that's what I'd throw back to CASA. Do what you say you're going to do. Follow your own enforcement model. Follow administrative law. Follow procedural fairness. Follow natural justice. Follow the minister's statement of expectations. Do your due diligence. I've got an interesting document here that it relates to this. This is called the Regulation Impact Statement. I'll just hold that up. So this was CASA was mandating to do what's called a regulation impact statement before they introduced regulatory change to assess its impact on industry. Now, this breaks my heart whenever I read this, because this is where a lot of our current problems stem from, Ben and Ken. In 2012, CASA put out a regulation impact statement about the impact of the change on business. I'll read it out because it's only one very short paragraph. It says, the existing flight crew training businesses will be required to meet new standards. However, again, while these represent a deviation from existing standards, the changes are relatively minor, which is supported by the feedback that CASA obtained from the consultation process. Well, pardon me, you can bleep me out if you want, but that is bullshit. There's no other way to put it. That part 141 and 142, every single flying school owner will concur. It was the biggest regulatory change to the industry since the Second World War. To say that the change is minor is rubbish. And to say that that is supported by the feedback that CASA obtained from the consultation process is a blatant lie. And the reason I can actually say that's a blatant lie is because I requested that feedback under freedom of information. Industry did not support that. And I challenge CASA to produce it. It's a blatant lie. It's incompetent. And
one of the sides of this argument, and we kind of touched on it before, you gave your reflection that you feel that the Nationals in this instance have failed you as an industry participant and potentially failed the industry on this.
And the country.
I tend to look at it, an opinion there. I tend to look at it on two sides here. I think that there's a huge opportunity for the Nationals. And the opportunity for the Nationals is to finally recognise that the voices from industry that have been calling for support and have been raising these concerns are in fact not the enemy. They are the Australian people, and they are in desperate need of political leadership to bring our industry out of this. I mean, if you had an opportunity to sit with the leadership of the Nationals, understanding that this issue is an issue that rests with Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, what would you say?
To be honest, I'd call on them for a leadership challenge, because I think the opportunity for a decision's already been made. Michael McCormack's made his decision. He's chosen not to set the National Party apart. He's chosen not for the National Party to separate themselves from the Liberal Party and actually really define their personality as a political party. He's chosen just to morph it into the Liberal Party. So I actually think he's missed the opportunity. And I think it's a bigger opportunity than the opportunity for aviation or for me. I think it's a regional Australia opportunity that's been lost. So and I'm not advocating for Barnaby Joyce. I don't know who the person is, but I think the National Party has to really step forward and take a new direction and set themselves very much apart from the Liberal Party and really define themselves as a political party.
Ken, obviously it's a contentious issue for the Nationals. Do you think is it your view that the Nationals have, I guess, in some way lost the ability to fix this issue under the leadership of Michael McCormack? Or do you think that this situation can be salvaged? Do you believe that Michael would be able to resurrect effectively the aviation industry by taking charge in this situation and bringing the industry forward and solving some of these problems?
Let me just put it another way for you. If you go, and I've done a couple of presentations overseas, if you go to Indonesia, the ministers responsible from those governments, they actually see the aviation industry as a job-creating industry. If you go to other countries and the same thing around Asia, they also see aviation as a job-creating industry. And you come to the situation here. And when we had that meeting up in Tamworth, there was a mittens there, and Darren Chester, and a lot of them, that they also supported saying that it was a job-creating industry. But somehow or other, in the last 10, 15 years, we seem to have lost this support to the fact that rural Australia could have thousands of jobs created, and it's not just direct jobs; it's also through indirect jobs. And that happen if you supported aviation as a job-creating industry. Now, to make it a job-creating industry, when you draft regulations, you've got to really think hard about what wording and how you represent it. Because at the end of the day, if the industry's not going to be there after you put the rules in place, you've actually failed in doing your job. And good regulations are, they create safety, and they create a safety culture. Secondly, the regulation should be then looked at how little red tape costs is put into the system. And then you can develop a set of regulations that work there. Now, there is no, in the American system, the FAA system allows the industry to make decisions of how they do it. And you've got to go back to Part 43. All Part 43 does is identify the individuals so they can do maintenance on the aircraft. And it goes individual or up to a 145 maintenance order. But it places the different responsibilities. Now, if you're an operator of the aircraft, you can then select any of those people who can release the product, the service. You can use it with it. Even the airlines can select an individual to work in the AMP, to work in the system, but that individual comes underneath their quality control. The same as they can use in the United States, Part 61 training organisations, low cost to set up, no little amount of red tape. The system works the same as they have over there with the independent maintenance orgs. No regulatory cost to get them up and running. That's why if you read the American system, if you move from that level that operates underneath Part 43 and 61, then you want to go into the higher commercial areas, virtually the FAA knows that you've already got a business that runs and works. And then the next step up is a much simpler test to go from a Part 61 training skill to a Part 141. And in fact, over there now, there's a lot of Part 141s that treat both factors. They operate as a 61 and a Part 141 training organisation. So if someone wants to come and do a training, they're not want to do a course, and they want to spread it over a few months, they treat those people as a Part 61 student. Whereas if they want to come in and do a well-organised course, they'll treat them as a Part 141 student. They try to keep the cost down. And the red tape that the FAA, they've spent years now reducing that red tape, where we seem to be going the other way. We want to put more and more red tape in. I think Glenn's probably right there where he said that's built around a bit of insecurity from the people that are actually listed within CASA, looking at the industry itself, unsure of that specific part of the industry and how it actually works. They're actually got themselves engrossed in the regulations and the support documentation without having the practical background within that part of the industry.
So, Glenn, obviously one of the hurdles that we run into with much of this is that whenever we start to have a conversation about generally trying to fix the system or respond to CASA, we run into a roadblock, and the roadblock is the word safety. CASA popped the word up. We're here to do safety. That's what we do. We're the safety authority, safety, 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 and it can usually park just about anything to a standstill. Do you believe CASA, and I know based on what you're saying this evening is that it appears that you really do not believe CASA's cost impact statement that said it would have a negligible impact on the cost for industry. Do you believe that the 141, 142 framework in any way improves safety for the industry?
No, I don't. And by CASA's own admission, when CASA, in the regulation impact statement, they say themselves that it's very hard to define what the safety benefits would be. And I think any system where people are distracted away from the core function actually takes away from safety. So when you're putting business has only got a certain amount of money. When I've got people doing ridiculous administrative tasks and massive submissions, that actually detracts from safety. So no, I don't think it's done anything for safety. It certainly hasn't. I don't know if I go so far as to say it's degraded safety, but it certainly hasn't improved safety. What it has done is reduce Australian jobs, damaged Australian businesses. Now, that might be acceptable if there's a measurable safety increase or a demonstrable safety increase. But if there's no safety increase, that impact can't be justified.
It's a really critical point that you raised there, Glenn, and that is if we keep allowing regulatory change, and on each cycle of regulatory change, the general aviation business community gets smaller and smaller, and we employ fewer and fewer people, we really should be asking the question, exactly what are we achieving? And it does contrast against the CASA organisation that appears to be growing annually. I often make comments to politicians and senators that it appears the most successful aviation business to be in is in the business of working for CASA. Oh, yeah. Because it's the only business in the industry that appears to be in a growth market where everything else is under the pump and desperately trying to survive. In terms of trying to survive and move forward, obviously the industry needs to bring new players in. What confidence can a new player have in making an investment in aviation, in setting up an AOC and not find themselves in exactly the same position that you found yourself in, which is to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into navigating the system as CASA required, to their specification, responding to their needs, only to find yourself within 6 to 12 months of being told, well, we've just changed our mind, not because the regulations don't allow you to do what you're doing, not because there's a safety concern with what you're doing, not because you've breached anything that we've required you to do, but simply we now have a different interpretation of what we want. So bad luck, too sad, so sad. I'm sorry we've wasted $500,000 or more of your money, Mr. Buckley, but we want you to leave. What is a new participant to this industry to think looking at this situation?
Ben, the people that have worked with me before in my family, I'm just going to quickly, I'm a very passionate Australian mate. I'm sitting here now in an Australian-made shirt, belt, pants and shoes, okay? I have a rule in my family. I don't care what present you give me, as long as it's Australian-made. My advice to anybody thinking of opening up a business in the aviation sector, do not do it. Dick Smith said it and it broke my heart. Dick Smith was a passionate Australian. And he got up there and said to people, on people in the public, get out of aviation. And it broke my heart. And I'll be honest, I have a lot of respect for him, but it somewhat annoyed me. But drawing on the last 2 years of unlawful, vindictive, vexatious behaviour from CASA, if you are an Australian business owner thinking of setting up in this industry, you would truly, and with my hand on my heart, Ben, don't do it. Leave it to the foreign ownership. Leave it to the big multinationals. You would be crazy to start.
It's a tragic statement, Glenn, and I can certainly understand your sentiment. And it's a sentiment that is actually shared by a growing number of people right throughout this country, that the situation is now so bad that you are taking such an enormous risk in making an investment in aviation, not because the aviation industry doesn't want the investment, not because the aviation industry can't support the investment, but the risk of being exposed to CASA, the CASA today that has no oversight and there are no checks and balances on their power and the way in which they use that power and deploy that power against the individuals in this industry. It is near commercial suicide to enter a market and believe that you can in any way negotiate to keep that beast at bay, which is a horrifying situation for the Australian people to find themselves in, that our government has allowed an authority such unfettered power. It really does need to change. Now, obviously, on the issue of change, CASA spend a lot of time in front of Senate inquiries trying to convince our senators that when they develop these regulations, they consult with industry, that industry is listened to, that they sit down and they take all these views and opinions from the people who have to work with these regulations at the coalface. the people who physically put their own money on the line. These are not government people. These are not authority employees. These are the people in Australia that take mortgages against their homes. They take savings out of their bank. They take savings out of their superannuation, and they invest it into this industry to run enterprise and business, and they rely on this industry for the employment of their staff and their livelihoods and ultimately their retirement. These are the people who know what they're talking about. They're the people who have to implement safety and maintain it within the industry. Is CASA listening to the advice of the flight training community with respect to the development of flight training regulations, or do you believe they are not?
There's no doubt in my mind, Ben, they're not listening. They're not. There's no doubt in my mind. The industry, it needs. I won't put a name on it, but I know he's watching because he sent me a text here. So one of my staff members put a very good. What CASA needs is cultural, psychological change. They seriously need to get a consultant into that organisation that actually specialises in organisational psychology. Change the psychology. That's the only way it's going to change, or strong government leadership. Otherwise, the industry is doomed. Nothing will change.
Ken, obviously the maintenance and engineering side of the industry is exposed to the same problems, but just on the engineering side. I know you have said time and time again, and I have seen the frustration on your face as we sit in our meetings at the head office at Bankstown. CASA are not listening to industry, and they are not taking on board the changes that are needed to rectify the downward spiral and to put this aircraft back in a state of climb. We're heading for, a classic CFIT. It'll be an industry-wide CFIT if we keep this up. How are we going to turn this around? How do we get the attention of CASA for them to understand that the direction they've been heading is wrong and it needs a course reversal?
Ben, I will go that you talk to anyone in the industry nowadays, especially if they're blokes have been around 10, 15 years or sort of thing or more, they've said that we've seen the best part of aviation. It's been virtually drummed out of the existence, and it goes right back, as I've said, since the birth of Part 21, that started a decline in the number of small maintenance orgs that could do manufacturing, but regulatory change, even going back with the creation of the Civil Aviation Act and the Civil Aviation Regs in '88. The independent flight instructors we had in our system, they were put in place underneath a regulation in the ANO. That regulation never came across. We lost thousands of independent flight instructors. We had a booming aviation industry back then. But rural Australia was full of aviation. Half the pilots, and more than half the pilots that were flying airlines, all come out of country Australia. It's something, anyone in the National Party or anyone that's trying to win seats politically in the country areas, they should be looking at creating regulations that actually helps create jobs. Safety is a system you put in place by not so much by regulation, but by ensuring the culture of the industry and the individuals have that inbred into their system. It's the people that create safety. It is not regulation. Now, ICAO has even admitted that, and the FAA admitted that 20 years ago. They made the point. They can reduce the accident rate. They don't need to change the regulation. It's all about education, training, culture. And what we're trying to do is trying to write safety in by creating a myriad of regulations and ministry procedures that have created so much red tape that if you take someone in a flying school, or they'd spend all day just filling out the paper for the work that they need to meet the system. It's happening now towards the maintenance industry. An application form to become an AOC, it's multi-pages of it. If you same with the maintenance org, the FAA application form for a maintenance org is 2 pages. We've created a red tape empire that needs a complete look at and complete revamp. If you've got to write a regulation and then you've got to write a manual of standards the same size as the regulation, then there's something wrong with the actual wording and what you're asking for in the regulation.
there's a lot to take on board there, Ken, and I guess I reflect on the fact that, and you would know this quite well, that when we do get the opportunities to meet with senators and politicians on this issue, we get a 10 or a 20-minute window. We've got 10 or 20 minutes with our elected officials to try and convey to them the complexity of the problem, the nuances of the solutions. And typically in one sitting with one of these politicians, you can't physically cover the content. And in fairness to the politicians, there are politicians out there like Senator Susan McDonald, which she's such a breath of fresh air to this industry and has firmly stood in support of general aviation from the very outset of coming into political life. And only today was referencing an article from the ABC, which very eloquently encapsulates the demise of general aviation and the challenge facing people in regional Australia that want to maintain access with aircraft. And so we have a real problem in being able to interface. And what's clear is that CASA and its conversations are overwhelming the conversations we need to be having as industry with the politicians. I mean, do we need to put together another general aviation summit and bring together the industry to try and have this conversation, Ken? Or what other mechanisms are there for us to try and have this conversation in a way in which the substance can be understood and can be acted on?
And from my point of view, that the system can be fixed, and it's not that hard to fix. It's the way they structure and they write regulations. Now, I know when we were there, we went through a whole review and look at exactly how you phrased and put that together. It is unclear today that where the responsibility what you got to do is write a regulation and the advice material so you make the industry fully responsible for doing what they do, and you keep the regulator out of the involvement part of getting it through. Now, one of the benefits of doing that, you turn around and say to whoever's looking for an authorisation, you list the aviation standards and say, if you can meet those aviation standards, then you're entitled to operate. Now, you get the clarity when Morrison, the inquiry in the middle of the 70s, put in the fact that you've got to have these aviation safety standards. Well, the manual of standards, which is more procedural than safety standards, CASA now says that's part of their safety standards. Well, I don't think what Morris intended ever came into fruition, the regulatory system. And that's one of the points. David Forsyth's initial report, they identified a huge amount of the fixes. If they were followed properly and put in place, half our worries wouldn't be here today. But we seem to have had our head in the sand, and all we're doing is developing regulations, red tape, and then the industry, it's in a sad, sad state right around Australia. And you go to any company airport nowadays, and the amount of air traffic going through there is minimal. Some airports don't even see an aircraft. So
I'm conscious of time here, Ken. I'm going to have to jump in, and I promised I'd try and keep this no later than an hour and a half tonight, given it's 8:30 already, or 8:28 already. I just have a couple of last questions which I really would like to direct through to Glen, and that is, based on your experience, Glen, and what you have been through, and given that the Minister extends his powers through to the board of CASA, and it is CASA's board's responsibility to ensure that the powers of the organisation are not being abused, either it's executive management or even middle management. It's there to actually ensure that CASA stays on track. Should the board of CASA be sacked and replaced with representatives from across this industry who directly understand the challenges of each of the sectors, and the board empowered by the Minister to set about making the necessary changes and driving those changes through an entirely new executive management? I understand that the Director of Aviation Safety's role is currently up, but it's the view of many across the industry that it should be not just the DAS role that's being reset at this point in time. There's a strong support from industry that says the entire executive management team and legal team and a good portion of the middle management team should be moved on from this organisation to enable a broad and swift cultural reform of the organisation. Would such a strategy work?
I guess that goes back to my earlier points. I think that's the only solution. I really do. I think the executive management there, and I won't name them, but and we have run out of time. But I would, I'd even like you to consider doing another one of these sessions, because I would like to potentially carry this on for another 1 hour session to expose some of the conduct of these personnel.
Glenn, I'm going to stop on that, and what I'm going to say to you is I'm going to give you my firm undertaking that I am going to stop at nothing to get you the opportunity to sit before the Australian Parliament and to make a formal testimony and to provide your evidence directly to the Parliament so this Parliament can take action. You deserve justice. You deserve the right to be heard, and you deserve the right for your issues to be dealt with. And if CASA has acted improperly, you deserve that to be held to account and those people to answer to what they've done. And I'm going to give you that direct undertaking, but I will not stop until we achieve that outcome for you.
Okay. And I will let them decide, given that opportunity for me to publicly speak about the unlawful conduct of some of the, they will leave the organisation. They will have no option. People's hands will be forced. Those executive management team in that organisation, once I expose, this is the tip of the iceberg, I have very specific allegations of unlawful conduct, fabricated evidence. Those people will be forced to leave, and that will be the start of change.
So a change of the CASA board, would that bring about meaningful change?
Well, there's 2 new members of the CASA board, so I can't speak to them. They've started in July. My hope is that they'll stand up, that they will hear this. Those 2 new members of the CASA board, I hope those 2 ladies will stand up and give me the opportunity to present my evidence. The other members of the board, that Jane Carmody, completely failed in my opinion. The chairman of the board, Tony Matthews, in my opinion, I'm not supposed to do names, I know it, but I accept responsibility, completely failed. Mr Rindflesh, been on the board since before this started. They've been afforded too many opportunities to act with integrity. They've chosen not to step up and act with integrity or good intentions. So I'm very firmly calling on Mr Michael McCormack, as I have asked him, give me the opportunity to spend 90 minutes with you or somebody that you nominate, and those people will be forced to step down from the board. So, yes.
It's obviously a complicated issue, but in the same sense, Ken, it's not a complicated issue. There is right and there is wrong. There is definitely something rotten in the state of Denmark on this issue, and it needs to be looked at. I'll put the same question to you, Ken. A sacking of the CASA board and a sacking of the entire executive management team of CASA and their legal departments, and a refresh in order to drive swift and broad reform to enable and to give the minister and his team the ability to drive meaningful change to correct what is now become decades of abuse of this industry. Will it work?
I think board change. The board has to be more aviation orientated with the board members. And I think that's been recognised every time there's been a board. Like I've been there when it's been a board and then a board's not needed. But when you've got aviation people from the aviation industry with a bit of history, then boards can work. But they need to have that industry experience. CASA executive, the government's got to bite the bullet and say, are we going down one direction or another? And I said to talk to a bunch of people not recently, and I just said to them, I said, look, maybe that we should be doing what a lot of South American countries have done and ask the FAA for some senior management to come out here to help transition to a straight FAA system. And I think that might fix Australia.
Gentlemen, as usual, it is always an absolute pleasure to catch up with people from across the industry. Glenn, I understand for you this has been a highly emotional period of your life, and you and I have had some conversation right at the very thick of this. I will never forget that phone call on the eve of Christmas. It still strikes me to this day, and it's hard to believe that participants of our industry have to suffer the indignity that is forced upon the industry. It is wrong. And I know that you haven't got the minister to apologise, which he bloody well should have done, and he should have demanded that there be a level of inquiry for this to hold some accountability. But there are a great number of us across this industry that feel for you and your family. And I want you to know that AOPA is there for you, and we will continue to fight. And I know Ken and AMROBA and a lot of people are all quite upset with what's gone on and the destruction of your business. You have some very powerful allegations. You should be given that opportunity to put that information forward, and our government, the Australian government that is supposed to be here for the Australian people, should be giving you the decency of that hearing. And so I hope the senators that are listening and the MPs that are listening, please, it's time to do the right thing by the Australian general aviation industry, and it's time to treat our industry with some dignity and to give us the opportunity to speak about these issues and to bring it forward and to bring an end to the decades of abuse that this industry has suffered at the hands of a regulator that gets paid no matter how abhorrent its behaviour goes. So thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Ken. We will be back again next week with another Facebook Live session. And until then, good night.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers. Good night.